You finish the meeting, send the notes, and let the room move on before anyone names who actually rebuilt the decision tree after the manager drifted off. Nobody calls that theft because the room prefers cleaner words. It calls you collaborative, reliable, easy to work with. Those words are not praise in the way you needed. They are evidence that your contribution arrived without a visible claim attached to it, which is why the room treats it like common property. That is not modesty. It is a transfer of value. This is the unpaid invoice. At the end of a project meeting, you hear someone summarize the plan you built and say, "We," in a way that removes the seam where your work began. You do not correct it cleanly. You either soften into a nod or add one more sentence until your point sounds like a request for permission. That is how a capable person starts to identify as the one who keeps things smooth, useful, and low friction, rather than the one whose name belongs on the work. The inversion is simple. In social systems, credit does not drift toward merit. It drifts toward the person who marks the boundary of the contribution. And researchers studying status allocation have found that unmarked work is quickly absorbed into the room's shared memory. At tomorrow's stand-up or client call, notice who repeats your sentence after you make it smaller than it was, and watch how quickly the room agrees with the cleaner version. Once you keep absorbing the cost, the room starts budgeting for your silence. This is the over-explain proof. In a discussion about timelines, you give 3 reasons before you have even said the actual boundary, because you already expect the room to treat a clean claim as an attitude problem. You can hear yourself stacking context, examples, and disclaimers until the point is buried under the evidence meant to protect it. A person who does this has usually built a self-concept around being more defensible than visible. The inversion is that the extra detail is not interpreted as integrity. It is read as insecurity. And the same pattern shows up in group dynamics research, where the person who preemptively justifies is granted less authority than the person who states less, leaves, and lets the room sit with the claim. On the next team call, notice the instant you start sounding like your own lawyer instead of the person who has the right to set a limit. When you have trained people to expect the explanation, they stop listening for the claim. This is the late correction. You notice the misattribution in the meeting while it is happening, but you let the room keep moving. Then reopen the issue by message after everyone has gone back to their work. You tell yourself that waiting was tactful, yet the real reason is that the room felt safer once nobody could interrupt, dismiss, or watch you struggle for the sentence. That habit belongs to someone who has learned to preserve dignity by choosing the only moment left where dignity cannot be taken from them. The inversion is colder than that. Delayed correction does not protect respect. It teaches others that your boundary is optional in public. And the same pattern shows up in missed handoff and exit interview observations, where the person who waited is remembered as less certain than the person who spoke first, even when the facts were identical. At tomorrow's debrief or over lunch with the same colleague, notice how quickly your correction turns into a private complaint. If it is not made while the room is still listening, a boundary that arrives after the room has moved on does not alter the room. This is the status audit. At a planning meeting, you watch the person who repeats your idea with cleaner wording and decide you are looking at the problem exactly right, because they are the type who benefits from other people's labor. In a 10-person office meeting last month, one analyst kept prefacing every point with caution. Another rephrased her point as if it was his, and the manager thanked him for clarifying the room. By the end, the analyst was silent, and the copy was carrying the authority. You are not only spotting the status move in other people, you are using the scan itself to stay safe, which means your attention has become part of the behavior you are trying to study. The inversion is that constant detection is not neutral intelligence, and the same pattern appears across ordinary rooms. The person who enters already monitoring, who will take credit, usually makes the room feel like a hierarchy before anyone else does, which is why the room gets colder before anyone raises a voice. At tomorrow's cross-functional meeting, notice whether you spend more time tracking who is rising than tracking what you need. A room can feel your monitoring before it can hear your complaint. This is the apology claim. You ask for the correction, the credit, or the clarification with a soft lead-in, Then listen to yourself shrink the request before anyone is answered. And you can tell yourself that you are being considerate of the other person's time. Your default interpretation is that this makes you easier to work with than the colleague who states the same boundary without the padding. You are not being considerate. You are prepaying for a verdict that has not been delivered, and that habit belongs to a person whose internal model of the room still expects a penalty for directness. The inversion is that apology does not lower friction. It lowers status, and the same pattern shows up in request, framing research around direct asks and social friction. Once the ask is pre-treated as optional, people respond to the optionality, not the content. In the next conversation with a manager, a partner, or the person who forgot to mention your name, notice how quickly the apology appears before the sentence that mattered. Credit in social systems follows the visible boundary, not the invisible burden. The person who absorbs the cost without naming it trains the room to treat that cost as part of the floor. Once that happens, respect no longer has to be taken from you. It simply stops arriving. A useful person can remain at the center of the work while sliding out of the center of perception. That is how a group keeps functioning while one person becomes increasingly optional. Credit goes to the person who makes the claim while the room is still listening. Silence turns contribution into ambient labor, and ambient labor gets treated as free in every room that rewards convenience over ownership. The pattern underneath this one governs status at a level most people never examine. And it is harder to see than what this video has shown you. Think back to the last meeting, dinner, or group chat where your work was repeated by someone else while you stayed quiet. Did you correct it before the room moved on? Or did you let the moment pass and replay it later in private? If any of this landed, the unpaid invoice, the late correction, the apology before the ask, you already know why this channel exists. It is not for people who need motivation. It is for quietly competent professionals who are tired of watching their work get absorbed into we, while their name stays in the document footer. Because here is what the room won't tell you. Credit doesn't drift toward merit. It drifts toward the person who marks the boundary, while the room is still listening. That pattern runs deeper than any meeting you've ever sat in. And yes, we're covering that next. If you are ready to stop being the most useful person who somehow became optional, hit subscribe. That is who this channel is for.